Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the Krasno Global Event Series. It is great to see so many of you here again today. Today, our event comes from the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Our distinguished guest today is Professor Sung-Yoon Lee of Tufts University. I will introduce him to you in a minute. I'm Klaus Larres, and I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. At present, I'm a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. The Wilson Center is a research center and think tank which does outstanding work on global affairs and many other things. I've been running the Krasno event series for quite some time now, but we are still going strong. Today, we are talking about what is going on in North Korea and what is going on in the ruling Kim family. Our event is entitled Kim Jong-un's Sister, the most powerful and dangerous woman in North Korea. I will conduct a conversation with Professor Lee and try to get as many insights as possible about the situation in this isolated and Stalinist country and the people who run it. There's no one better to explain the complex situation to us than our distinguished guest today, who himself grew up in South Korea, and that is, of course, Professor Sung-Yoon Lee. Sung-Yoon Lee is a scholar of Korean and East Asian studies and a specialist on North Korea. He is the Kim Korea Foundation Professor in Korean Studies and Assistant Professor at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University in Boston. At present, he is also a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. We are colleagues here and kind of office neighbors. He is just down the corridor. Yoon is the author of the book entitled The Sister, North Korea's Kim Yo Jong, the most dangerous woman in the world. The book has just been published by Public Affairs, and it is available right now in all good bookstores and, of course, on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. And Yoon has had a very successful launch with his book. His book has been all over the media. He has been interviewed on CNN and many other channels. And therefore, it's a great pleasure that he found the time to also join the Krasno events today. And before I pepper Professor Lee with a lot of questions, let me just point out that, as always, we are videotaping the event today for our famous YouTube channel, on which the videos of all our events can be watched again. The address is youtube.com/KrasnoUNC. We have a great international Zoom audience today, and everyone is most welcome to submit your questions to our speaker today by making use of the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Our Krasno assistant, Trinity, will select your questions and read them out aloud to all of us. Professor Lee, thank you for joining us today. It's great that you can make it.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the opportunity, Professor Larres. I'm honored.
You're more than welcome. But let me ask you straight away. North Korea's supreme leader, Kim Jong-un, recently visited Putin. What is the situation right now between Russia and North Korea? Will North Korea deliver weapons to Russia for use in the Ukraine war? Or what was the outcome of that meeting?
Well, presumably the North Korean leader did not make this long journey just to have some good Russian caviar and drink good vodka. When the reclusive North Korean dictator makes a long multi-day lumbering journey on the family, bulletproof, armored, swanky train, the world tends to tune in. And that summit meeting between Putin and Kim captured the global headlines over several days last week. What happened? Well, the two men met for the second time. The first time it was in April 2019. And the second meeting seemed to be much more successful, a happier occasion. I pretend to read body language, the body language of important personages, and Kim looked visibly happy. Putin looked a lot less glum than 4 years ago. So I think both leaders got what they wanted, or at least the promise of what the other would give you. North Korea, we know, needs from Russia support with high-tech military technology like ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, nuclear-powered submarine, satellite launch in space, and so on. And Putin very graciously said that, yes, I will help North Korea with satellite technology. And that is in direct contravention of 10 United Nations Security Council resolutions that Putin himself had endorsed over the last 15 years or so. And Putin, of course, needs from North Korea ammunition, artillery shells, and small arms, sniper rifles, and bullets, and so on. And North Korea has tons of such things. So it's a win-win, as they say, for the two despots, one of the most disdained dictators in the world today. And, you know, on one level, it's kind of sad. Russia once was a great power with great history, cultural epochs of cultural achievement in literature, music, you know, a big country. But now the leader of Russia is asking North Korea for handouts. Well, not exactly, but with help, because North Korea is one of a handful of countries in the world, just a handful, that is openly and vigorously supportive of Russia's war in Ukraine. So I see, you know, some military exchange in the days and weeks coming up. I take the view, and this is speculation, it's unfounded, but probably Putin wants some manpower as well, North Korean soldiers, not in combat necessarily, but making a contribution as laborers, as medics, as engineers, perhaps combatants as well in the border region, because North Korea has manpower to spare to sell. The regime does not really show high regard for human life, including the lives of its own people. So North Korean soldiers to the Kim regime are expendable. And of course, the Kim regime can ask for lots of money and grain and fuel from Russia in return. So it was a meeting of the despots.
But I thought the Russians had a lot of manpower themselves, that they could mobilize if they wanted over 2 million Russian young men. So why would they need manpower from North Korea?
Well, yes, but Russia has been taking a big toll, of course, and the longer the war drags on, I think the more weary even the Russian population may become. So for special operations, certain operations, we know North Korea is very adept, capable. They have a capable military force who have participated in small-scale campaigns in Syria, in several countries in Africa, and so on. So it's an option for Putin and Kim to address, perhaps. But again, this is not based on any high intelligence. I'm just speculating as an observer.
Thank you. So what is North Korea getting out of it? You mentioned money, you mentioned grain, perhaps some technology, but in the media it was also mentioned that space technology was at issue. Do you believe that is true, that Kim wants to shoot a missile into space and develop that sort of technology as well?
Yes, and this year North Korea has tried twice to launch a satellite into space in late May and also recently last month, and both were failures. So they need some help, and Russia has such technology to share if the Russian leadership wants to. Why does North Korea aspire to launch satellites in space? Because they suffer the disadvantage when it comes to surveillance, reconnaissance, because the other team, South Korea, has had, thanks to the alliance with the United States, much intelligence sharing, not everything, of course, but the United States is able to see a lot of what's going on inside North Korea with its space technology, whereas North Korea doesn't. Well, for Putin to publicly say, yes, I will help you, that's pretty brazen. That's pretty audacious. Of course, the invasion of Ukraine itself is 10 times, 100 times more brazen and audacious. But both men like to stick it to the United States. And what I mean by that rough expression is they want to instill in the United States and its allies like South Korea and Japan in the region long-term concern. Not yet panic, of course, but concern, knowing anxiety, building up bit by bit, the return of the Cold War dynamic of Moscow, Beijing, Pyongyang on one side, now more consolidated than it has been in perhaps 2 decades. That creates concern in Washington. And in a sense, it's a clever ploy. Even if this meeting and the agreement doesn't go anywhere, which I doubt, but still, North Korea and Russia have successfully planted gnawing anxiety, that dragging, that kind of apprehension about greater security threat to the United States and its allies in the region. And what that means is when the North Korean dictator does a complete turnaround and says, hello, let's meet, and beaming smile says, let's talk about peace, denuclearization, reunification, normalization of diplomatic relations, that message will sound all the more tantalizing, perhaps even real, especially if a young, pretty woman is the face of that charm offensive. That's where Kim Jong-un's sister comes in.
Before we come to the sister, let me ask, what does China say about it all? Because China is a traditional protector of North Korea rather than Russia. And China was a passive bystander, or did China play a role in the background somehow?
It's been a while since Kim made a trip to Beijing. The last trip was in January for his birthday banquet, January 8th. 2019. So it's about time he made another trip to China. China, I would assume, has been keenly observing all this play out, and China doesn't want to fall behind in exercising influence over North Korea. What I mean is, for the first 6 years or more for Xi Jinping, who came to power in late 2012 and early 2013, and Kim Jong-un in early 2012, for the next 6 years, the two never met. Xi Jinping visited South Korea in 2014, but had not visited North Korea until June 2019. And when Kim Jong-un oversaw his nation's third nuclear test on February 12, 2013, pardon me, right in the middle of the most important national holiday in China, Lunar New Year celebrations, Xi Jinping's first as the top leader of China, President Xi grew very irritated, very displeased, and he told President Obama, I'm going to teach that SOB a lesson. I don't know what the Chinese expression he used was, probably Wang Badan or something like that, but Xi, on a phone call with Obama, told Obama that I'm going to teach that SOB a lesson. How do I know this? Because Obama told me. And then Obama asked me, will China turn the tap off? I said, no, sir. Maybe a slap on the wrist and then go back to giving more to North Korea. And indeed, for the rest of the year, two-way trade hit an all-time high of $6.5 billion. The point here being that it's in China's national interest, not only not let North Korea collapse, but to build it up as an ace card to play against the more important long-term adversary or strategic competitor, the United States of America.
Thank you. And of course, you're perfectly right that also Beijing doesn't want to see Russia collapse or lose Ukraine war either. So let me turn now to the sister, and your book is all about the great leader's sister. She is the power behind the throne. She seems to have much more influence than we all realized in the West. And you have dug that up and you have pointed out her importance. And you will tell us, why is she so important?
Thank you. May I just say, before I forget, thank you for your very kind introduction. Just to set the record straight, I'm no longer with the Fletcher School, Tufts University, my beloved alma mater. I had the privilege of studying there and teaching there for many years. So I just wanted to say that. She is a fascinating figure to me. Why? Because we have never seen in North Korean history a preeminent, powerful female personage who wields real power. Is she all talk and is there no bite? No, I don't think so, because with the onset of COVID in early 2020, Kim Jong-un rapidly elevated his trusted sister publicly, and she has issued over 40 formal written statements since the first in March 2020. And I think it was in part an attempt by Kim Jong-un to, I don't know, take out a life insurance for his family, just in case something happens. We know Kim Jong-un is not in optimal health. just in case something happens, because whereas there has never been any serious intention, any sign of an imminent US attack on North Korea since the Korean War armistice of 1953, although North Korea plays up that paranoia. And whereas there's never been an uprising, a public demonstration against the Kim regime, COVID, it can kill both princes and paupers alike without discrimination. We've seen that before. Of course, powerful, wealthy people have better access to healthcare and all that, but it does not discriminate. So I think this was the first existential threat that Kim Jong-un has felt in his entire life. And who better than his trusted family member, capable sister, to emerge as the supreme leader in the event Kim Jong-un becomes incapacitated. And Kim Yo Jong, in June that year, in 2020, she issued a written statement calling on South Korea to criminalize sending leaflets and anything else into North Korea. That is, make a law that makes it a crime punishable by imprisonment and fine to basically share information and basic amenities. And also in the same month, in June, Kim Yo Jong, on the 13th of June, 2020, issued a statement referring to this 4-story building in Kaesong, just inside North Korea, near the border, a joint North Korea-South Korea liaison tower. She said this useless building will be gone in a few days by the authority granted by Chairman Comrade, the party, and the state. She was basically saying, I'm running the show, our policy now. And 3 days later, demolished it was in broad daylight. So she wields real power.
Thank you. It sounds that Kim is putting forward his sister as his potential successor, but that is kind of unusual. Usually it goes from the father to the son, and he has a young daughter. And does that in the end mean that when the daughter is old enough, she's 13, something like that right now, if once she is old enough, maybe 20 or older, then the sister will be pushed aside and the succession will go to the daughter? Is that what you expect, or will the sister remain in the limelight?
No one can see that far into the future, but North Korean history is replete with fratricide, avunculicide, murder of the uncle, nepoticide, murder of the nephew. And of course, Kim Jong-un and Kim Yo Jong had their uncle publicly humiliated, who was the de facto number 2 person upon their father, Kim Jong-il's death in late 2011. I thought the uncle, Chang Song-taek, would probably be executed within 5 years. It happened much sooner, within 2 years in the Kim Jong-un era. And I think when the time comes, let's say the daughter 15 years from now is in her mid to late 20s and is about to be granted some real power or to be made as the first female supreme leader of North Korea. At that moment, when the auntie is about to be relegated to the role of the regent, useful advice dispensing, nice auntie, but really kind of pushed aside. Will Kim Yo Jong remember or not that wrathful, nipping winter of 2013 when the Kim siblings had their uncle tortured and killed? Will she strike first? Who knows? We can't, predict the future, but it's a family dynasty pretending to be a communist republic. So power must remain in the family. And for now, there is no other person than Kim Yo Jong, who is of the direct bloodline, direct descendant of the founder, the grandfather, Kim Il-sung, who is capable. Kim Jong-un and Kim Yo Jong, they have an older sibling, a brother, but he's never been seen in public in the Kim Jong-un era, with Kim Jong-un, that is, and he has no acumen, no wish for any kind of power or politics. So I don't think he's in the running, the older brother. And again, Kim Jong-un's daughter, she's prepubescent, she's cute, but she's a child. What can a little child to do? Receive a foreign delegation, issue a public speech? I mean, it will take time. So my simple contention, speculation is that for the next 15 years, it's only Kim Yo Jong.
And the relations between brother and sister are pretty good. And it goes back to their time in Switzerland, I understand. They both were educated for a few years in Switzerland, and they established good relations during that time. But the Swiss experience, which after all is a democratic country with a very participatory democracy, doesn't seem to have rubbed off on the two of them at all, has it?
I too have lived in Switzerland. I love Switzerland, but exposure to Switzerland or any other advanced European power, exposure to European cosmopolitanism has a mixed record when it comes to dictators. For every Deng Xiaoping, who studied in Paris when he was a young man for about 4 years, and did indeed take his nation down a much more constructive, happier path of reform and opening. For every Deng, there's a Pol Pot, who also studied in Paris as a young man in his 20s, about 4 years, but managed to kill so many of his own people. So the fact that Kim Jong-un has lived in Switzerland, and when he took over, many observers wished for Kim Jong-un to become a reformer, or even flat out said it will happen. I thought that was a poor indicator. The more reliable indicator of positive change, reform, and all those good things would be if North Korea dismantled gulags, political prisoner concentration camps, if North Korea downsized its hyperinflated military, one of the largest, biggest standing armies. There are more, positive, credible indicators of change, and I don't see any right now.
Mm-hmm. Going back to the sister, you mentioned somewhere in your book, or you referred to her ruthlessness, and you already mentioned that she, together with her brother, killed the uncle, who seemed to be a threat to their power. How else? What else would you say? Why is she particularly ruthless? More ruthless than perhaps her brother, even, or more ruthless than other leaders in dictatorships?
Let me come to ruthless in a minute, but first say she's very rude. When she made her grand international debut by visiting South Korea on the occasion of the Winter Olympics, the opening ceremony hosted by South Korea, it seemed that much of the South Korean nation just fell in love with her because this was an important person. Kim Jong-un sent his own sister, so it must mean that Kim Jong-un has good intentions to change and all that. Well, it hasn't really turned out that way, but at least she was courteous. She smiled, and she showed up to meetings, and she was the darling of North Korea at the time. But since COVID, since she's been issuing written statements, again, over 40, each statement carries her signature, what I call in my book, Mona Lisa smirk smile. She has erect carriage, posture, has her chin up often, as if she's looking down on her interlocutor. There's arrogance and self-confidence visible in her facial expression, body language. But these written statements are very mean, very demeaning, very vituperative. And I see the kind of wicked, sardonic wit and anger and nastiness in her statements as compared to an outburst of really, really disgusting, racist, sexist, homophobic statements that North Korea issued in 2014 and 2015. I did not make the connection at the time, but I did note this was new. For example, with respect to the South Korean president, Park Geun-hye, the first female elected leader in the Confucian civilization in East Asia before Tsai Ing-wen, North Korea referred to Park as, quote, dirty old prostitute. In a particularly vile statement in May 2015, North Korea called Park Geun-hye, quote, stinky Obama pelvis licking, skirt lifting, dirty old whore. That's a quote. With respect to the Honorable Judge Michael Kirby, who was the principal drafter of a monumental UN report on human rights in North Korea, published in February 2014, over 300 pages, who is openly gay, North Korea referred to Judge Kirby as, quote, disgusting lecher with a 40-year career in homosexuality, end quote. And with respect to President Obama, quote, wicked black monkey that should go back to its natural habitat in Africa and feed off the breadcrumbs thrown at it by tourists, end quote. Many examples of such nature, truly, horrible. But my point here is Kim Yo Jong, at the time, was the de facto head of her nation's very powerful, important agency or ministry, that is the Propaganda and Agitation Department. I'm not saying she wrote all this. North Korea recruits the nation's most capable, refined writers for everything, for history, for narratives, for propaganda. So it's a group effort, but she would have signed off on it. She would have approved the issuance of such vile statements in 2014, 2015. And under her own name, she's called the current South Korean president, a political idiot, the former South Korean president, parrot raised in America, mentally retarded, President Biden is senile, and so on. So how can a royal princess have such a potty-mouthed, vile personality? Well, in North Korea, it shows you that you have power. And again, she can turn on a dime. And when she comes out smiling and says, let's meet President Biden, let's meet, I want to come to the White House, it will be kind of hard, very hard. Politically, I think impossible for the US or South Korea or other nations to turn their back on such a pleasant proposal, because then you look like the petulant party uninterested in war, and that's advantage North Korea. And due to the latent pervasive sexism in many of us, men and women, may I suggest, we tend to patronize, kind of underestimate young women, and we will be prone to thinking that, oh, she's malleable, we can control her, I can influence my great charisma or wealth or power or whatever, intelligence, and sort of mold her. I don't think so. I think the North Koreans, have a plan, the other team, not so much.
What do we know about her personal life? Is she married? Has she got children? Has she got real friends? Or is it just all about power? There must be a personal life.
We don't know. I don't know. When she visited South Korea, she reportedly told South Koreans that she's married, that she has a child, that she's pregnant, in fact. And photos from her visit to South Korea in February 2018 show her around her midsection to be a bit bigger than photos thereafter. Next time we saw her in public was at the Inter-Korean Summit meeting at the border village between Kim Jong-un and President Moon on April 27th that year. So she may have given birth then, she may have 2 children. That's the speculation. But, the regime shrouds itself with layers, veils of mystery and mystique. And there's a good reason for that, because there's great tragic irony here, but Kim Jong-un is really unfit to be the king. Why? Because of his family history. In North Korea, every newborn is thrust onto a political class. Largely, there are 3 classes: the top, loyal class; the middle, wavering class; and the lowest, despised, hostile class. Who gets branded as a member of the hostile class? Well, former Catholics, Christians, Buddhists, if you practice religion, if you are a family member of a defector, a traitor, as they say, if you were formerly a capitalist, had property under the colonial rule, 1910 to 1945, and if you resettled in North Korea in the post-45 era at some point from Japan. Kim Jong-un's mother, Ko Yong-hee, who passed away from breast cancer in 2004, was born in Japan. Her father, Ko Yong-hee's father, Kim Jong-un's maternal grandfather, worked for the Japanese Imperial Army in a textile factory making uniforms. So that is a state secret that must be guarded, that the great leader, so-called, is the son of a Japan-born Japanese Koreans that resettled, Korean Japanese that resettled in North Korea. And then there's more. The grandfather, he went to church. He played the church organ, Kim Il-sung. His father attended an American Christian missionary established school, and his mother was a deaconess in a church. So the progeny of practicing Christians are, they are sent to gulags, they are branded members of the hostile class. Then there's more. Ko Young-hee, the mother of Kim Jong-un, had a sister who took care of Kim Jong-un, Kim Yo Jong, and their older brother Kim Jong-chul in Switzerland with her own husband and their own 2 children. What happened? The auntie's family defected to the despised principal enemy of North Korea, as they say, the United States of America in 1998. So that's a trifecta, no. Christianity in their family history, resettlers from Japan, and traitors. If Kim Jong-un or Kim Jong-un were a normal person, they would have lived a very different life of hardship, torture, starvation, ration, and so on. So there are secrets that North Korea really wants to guard.
Thank you. There have been many attempts by the Western world, particularly by the United States, or led by the United States, to come to an agreement with North Korea initially about its nuclear program in return for generous economic aid. And all that didn't lead to anything. And the high point of Western contacts with North Korea was probably the visit or the meetings between President Trump and Kim. And these meetings, in the end, petered out. They did not lead to anything. Would you regard in hindsight that an opportunity was missed, that all the problems we see now, both with Kim and his sister and the rapprochement with Putin and the escalating missile race and missile attempts to develop the technology, that all that could have been avoided if something different had happened in these meetings with Trump?
I don't know, but I do know the following. This persistent tendency to patronize North Korea, to not only belittle and mock them, and they're endlessly mockable. If there were such a thing as an international mockability index, North Korea would be #1 forever, perhaps. There's such a weird, mix of medieval mores and buffoonish bellicosity. They say crazy sounding things all the same. We are easily dismissive of them. We think they're small. Yes, they are. So if we are a bit more civil, treat them kindly, give them some money, maybe they'll be compliant. It doesn't work that way, because the great leader, so-called, is no dummy. People used to think Kim Il-sung was crazy. But when the geopolitical shift took place with Richard Nixon's visit to China in 1972, what did Kim Il-sung do? Well, all client states of both China and the United States, like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, or the US and Vietnam, North Vietnam, and countries like North Korea, were very concerned that the big power may abandon us. So what did Kim Il-sung do? He came out of his shell and met with, in succession, 2 reporters from the New York Times on May 26, 1972. Next month, a Washington Post reporter. The next month in July, a Harvard law professor, and many Japanese reporters. And all these visitors came away with the impression that Kim Il-sung is not only not crazy, but very intelligent, very well informed, even makes self-effacing jokes. Wow, he's a reasonable person. It happened with his son, Kim Jong-il. For the first 6 months upon inheriting power, he did not meet with a single world leader or travel outside his country. And all of a sudden, in May 2000, Kim Jong-il showed up in Beijing. Why? Because he had an important meeting with the South Korean president coming up in June, the first ever inter-Korean summit. And then in July 2000, Kim Jong-il received a man called Vladimir Putin. Putin, to date, is the only top Russian or former Soviet leader to have visited North Korea. And later in October, Kim Jong-il sent a special envoy to President Bill Clinton, carrying a big envelope, an invitation letter for Clinton to visit North Korea. Clinton was very curious. He wanted to go and sent his Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, within a fortnight to North Korea to ascertain whether it's feasible, it's doable. And it didn't happen because of the vote recount, Florida vote recount in the election competition between George W. Bush and Al Gore. And Al Gore only conceded defeat in mid-December, December 13th, and then simply time ran out. So Clinton, his visit did not happen, but undeterred, Kim Jong-il the next year in January visited China's special economic zone cities, visited Shanghai, Guangdong, Shenzhen, Zhuhai, all these cities. He visited Huawei and other high-tech companies, thus imitating Deng Xiaoping's his southern tour, so-called, on the occasion of the 10th anniversary of the reform started in 1982, thus coming across as a reasonable chap. And that's what Kim Jong-un did. For the first 6 years, never met with a single world leader, met with Dennis Rodman, the former great basketball star, partied with him all night, but did not travel outside. And then he showed up in Beijing again in late March 2018. Thus, he used his sister to soften up South Korea and to create expectations, exuberant expectations that North Korea now is on the verge of big change. Well, by then it was like Rambo 4. Rambo 1, First Blood, was a good movie, but by the time you've seen this over and over again, you sort of have a good idea how this movie is going to end.
So you're saying that Trump's visits and meetings with Kim were pointless. They did not stand a chance right from the beginning. He could just as well have saved the effort to enter into these conversations and love letters with Kim.
I'm not a psychic, but when you've seen this movie, when you've been repeatedly mauled by that tag team duo of history and reality, you can sort of see what's going to happen. Trump, not knowing, due to no fault of his own, not knowing much about North Korean history or strategy, when the proposal for a summit meeting was carried to him by senior South Korean envoys on March 8th, 2018, Trump said, okay, let's do it. The sooner the better, thinking that by virtue of his intelligence and charisma, he can sort of overpower or impress the North Korean dictator. No, he walked into a trap. Because even holding those talks, what did they achieve? Well, a lot for North Korea. The complete collapse of the international sanctions enforcement regime. Sanctions enforcement, like domestic law enforcement, people have to do it. It's laborious. It's hard work. But now, wow, we're on the verge of peace with North Korea. Unprecedented US-North Korea summit meeting. Wow. Sanctions enforcement became hollow as of mid-2018, whereas they've been strong for a little over a year throughout 2017. So yeah, Kim Jong-un, I would say, bought some more time and maybe money by virtue of sanctions enforcement relaxation, lax sanctions enforcement. It benefited North Korea, but not as much as he had hoped, because Trump, in their second meeting in February 2019 in Vietnam, he had personal issues. His former trusted lawyer, Michael Cohen, was testifying in Congress against Trump, calling him a liar, a cheat, a crook, and so on. So Trump stayed up all night watching this in Vietnam before his summit meeting with Kim Jong-un and grew kind of, impatient when they could not reach a deal. Trump said, okay, sorry, we tried. And he took off, leaving Kim Jong-un there like a tourist. I think that's probably, without doubt, the single most biggest public humiliation that Kim Jong-un has ever suffered. So the train ride home could not have been pleasant.
Thank you. Before we open it up to Q&A from our audience, let me ask you about the economic and social situation in North Korea today. They were also very badly affected by the pandemic, closed off the country for several years. What is the economic situation now? How are the people of North Korea doing? Do we know? And what about the so-called labor camps? Do they still exist? Have they expanded? Have they become worse? Or has there a certain degree of improvement in the meantime?
I don't know, but I know a few things. We do. North Korea operates political prisoner concentration camps. These are not people accused of having committed a crime like theft or murder or whatever. These are people branded by the state as a political prisoner, as a would-be traitor. What is their offense? Maybe they, accidentally stepped on a photo of Kim Jong-un in the party newspaper. Maybe they said life is terrible, life sucks, life is hard, and then a neighbor reported them. That's when you get disappeared or end up in a gulag. Conditions in North Korea have never been really good. They have seen better times decades ago. But what makes North Korea truly unique in world history is that it is the first, and I think only, industrialized, literate society. No illiteracy among the adult population, near 100% literate society, ever to have suffered a famine. And that was in the mid to late 90s, so about 30 years ago. And each year since, without fail, every year, according to UN reports, the food insecurity situation is very bad, one of the worst in the world, in the world's top 5, in terms of one index, the prevalence of undernourishment among the total population. North Korea is a population of, roughly 25 million, about 46 to 48% of the population are in chronic hunger, according to various studies. Why? You look at other countries on the list, there is no such list. I put one together. But these are all, immiserated economies where adult illiteracy, in some cases, is as high as 80%. Tremendous disadvantage, of course. Beset, in many cases, by war, uprisings. North Korea is a de facto peacetime economy, fully industrialized, urbanized, yet has one of the world's worst food problems. Why? Some people say due to climate change, due to poor soil management, bad luck, bad weather, US sanctions. Such a narrative seems to make sense because it's simple and it's baseless. No, it's by the decisions made by the leadership. They have money, but they refuse to spend even a tiny fraction of their vast wealth with which to import food. How much food? If they spent 200,000 million, 0.2 billion or 0.4 billion a year with which to import grain and distributed it fairly, no one would be hungry. Not a single man, woman, child needs to be hungry. They choose not to. Oh no, they're so poor, they can't do that. They can't afford it. It is simply not true. So, as this UN report of 2014 alleges, Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un are guilty of the crime against humanity of, quote, deliberate mass starvation, quote, knowingly causing prolonged starvation. That's a serious allegation, serious charge, but it's backed up by evidence over the past 30 years.
Thank you. Did you get very depressed when writing your book?
It's, for whatever I did in the prior life, it's my calling. It's my obsession. So, yeah, well, it is what it is. Somebody has to do it. And it's a small band of North Korea watchers in the United States. But, it's such a threat to regional peace and beyond the North Korean state. And it's such a uniquely weird, the strangest country in the world, I would argue, based on my own biases. It's such, from an intellectual standpoint, fascinating regime and country, but it's so sad. Earlier in the year, I had an occasion to visit the Panmunjom border village, and one of us on the delegation, Sir John Scarlett, former chief of the British Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, said to me, how do you feel looking into North Korea right now? And I said, profound sadness. I was born in South Korea by chance and grew up, lived in a developing and now affluent country freely. In North Korea, it's not only power that's handed down to the next generation, but also misery, pain, oppression, hunger. It's all hereditary because of the decisions made by the state.
Thank you. By both the great leader and his sister. And let's have some questions from the audience. Trinity, are you there? Hi, Trinity. Do we have some interesting and good questions? I'm sure we have. Can you ask the first one, please?
We do. From Louis Krishock from the Wilson Center, he says, how will the PRC react to this new cooperation between Russia and the DPRK?
Well, I expect China to pretty soon, if not already, invite Kim Jong-un to visit China again and to treat him to a fabulous banquet and various meetings, private meals with the First Lady of both countries. It's happened before, so that's my basis. But on the first visit in March 2018, first visit to China by Kim Jong-un, President Xi broke out a $200,000 bottle of Maotaijiu, Chinese, spirit, hard liquor. So China will wine and dine Kim Jong-un, promise lots of things. Why? Is it because out of altruism? Of course not. National interest. Having North Korea around is very useful. It's in China's great utility, national interest, to build up North Korea when the timing is right. And that's right now, in the wake of the meeting with Putin.
But are the Chinese not scared by North Korea's missile program and the nuclear missiles?
I don't think the Chinese are scared. I'm sure they have many concerns, but I think there is profound disdain and patronization of North Korea on the part of the Chinese, and vice versa. And you would think that makes no sense. How can a backward, tiny North Korea look down on China? They do. There's a lot of, amity between the two governments, but on a personal level, they look down on each other. North Koreans say, the Chinese may have bread, they may eat better than us, but we have pride. We're still faithful to the cause and so on. Well, that all sounds good, but not so much if your children are hungry. So there are multiple layers of nuance to the bilateral relationship, but China is North Korea's sole treaty ally. North Korea is China's only treaty ally. That's the reality.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Trinity, do we have another question?
Yes, from Joseph Holmes. First off, he thanks you, Professor Lee, and he just wants you to expand on your mention of North Korea's small-scale military operations in the Middle East and Africa. So to what extent has North Korean personnel seen combat outside the Korean Peninsula since the Korean War in 1953?
Thank you. I think the regime views its citizens as an asset in terms of labor, manpower, including its soldiers, that are convertible into cash. So for various reasons, strategic reasons too, of course, North Korea has sent people, laborers, out to many countries of the world to make money, to engage in illicit activities. North Korea has sent combat troops to Vietnam. Never officially, they never acknowledge it. North Korea views its people as a means for the regime to get wealthier. We know North Korea has proliferated extensively. North Korea built a prototype nuclear reactor in Syria. And largely, the US ignored it until Israel bombed it in September 2007. North Korea has proliferated uranium hexafluoride to Libya. North Korea doesn't abide by international norms and rules. Its diplomats from over 20 countries have been kicked out for blatant illegal activities like trafficking in banned animal products, selling illicit drugs, heroin, and so on, counterfeit US dollars, and so on. So, and North Korea has dispatched architects, builders, to build statues in at least 9 countries in Africa alone. So not much is known about the extent of North Korean combat activities around the world, but my point here is simply that it would not be an irrational decision for North Korea to send troops to help Putin at this particular time. It's an opportune time for North Korea to expand its national interest by being buddy-buddies with Vladimir Putin at the expense of their own people.
And the training of these soldiers and the equipment they have, that is competitive with, for example, Russian expertise and Russian soldiers or Western soldiers?
It's questionable. Ukraine has claimed that Ukraine has seized North Korean artillery on their way to Russia. And many of them are from the 1970s and 1980s, completely outdated. So we don't know how effective North Korean small arms might be, but we do know they have a lot. They build lots of weapons, and they can certainly dispense with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of artillery shells, which Putin needs in Ukraine.
And the quality of their soldiers, the training, the expertise, you would say that you would rank that highly?
I would err on the side of caution and assume that they're capable, because North Korean soldiers usually serve, it's mandatory service, of course, for about 10 years. And it's a hard life. They may complain, not outwardly, of course, that will get you disappeared. But one has to assume that they're disciplined. Now, if they are sent to Russia or Ukraine, will they defect? Perhaps. But that's the risk. There's a risk there in sending laborers or people to work in restaurants or even foreign diplomats. And some have defected, foreign diplomats. That is North Korean diplomats stationed abroad. So there's always that risk of defection, but I think it's an acceptable risk for North Korea.
Thank you. Trinity, do we have some more questions, please?
Yes, next is from Scott Schwartz. He wants to ask if there is possibly any way that the family might be overthrown by the military.
Well, it's a leitmotif, a recurring theme in history: coup d'etat, murder of the dictator, popular uprising. We don't even have to go back into history, but the decline and fall of states, both big empires and small, is a recurring theme. So the possibility cannot be ruled out. Do we see any credible signs of such fissures, such indicators of an imminent threat to the regime? I can't see any. I would not mind at all if that were the situation, but I'm unable to detect any. And as with other states that have fallen, I think the factors, the conditions that led to the fall will become clear only after the event, after it's happened. We will be able to understand why, where the signs were. But right now, I don't see any credible indicator of regime instability.
Thank you. Do we have another question?
We do. This one is from Ross Delston. Why is it that Kim Jong-un doesn't see his sister as a threat? Didn't he have his brother killed? And then he says things.
Thank you. The brother who was murdered, brazen act in broad daylight in an crowded international airport where you have cameras everywhere, with a most deadly nerve agent, chemical weapon, VX. The victim was a half-brother, so they had he came from a different mother. The two, Kim Jong-un and his half-brother, almost certainly never met in person. Kim Jong-il had several women, concurrently living with several women and their offspring at the same time. At one point, at least three in the early 1970s, and never allowed his children from Mother A to mix with children from Mother B. What was the reason that Kim Jong-un ordered the hit on his half-brother in 2017? Well, the older half-brother crossed the line. This is a criminal business, it's like the mob. How did he cross the line? He came out and was critical of Kim Jong-un being the successor, another father to son succession, and made some, I suppose, presumptuous remarks. Said, I hope my younger half-brother does the right thing. I stand against it, but I wish him well. That kind of challenge or even half-hearted criticism in public of the next great leader, I thought he was a marked man, even in 2009 or so, when he made these remarks to the Japanese press. And they waited, they waited for the perfect time, the perfect stage, in a brazen act of assassination before the cameras to send a message. This is what happens if you cross the line. And Kim Jong-il, by the way, had his own nephew murdered in South Korea because the nephew had defected to South Korea in 1982. He underwent extensive plastic surgery, but came out with a book, an expose on the royal family in 1996. He was short on cash and needed money. And of course, that crossed the line. And Kim Jong-il sent people to have him abducted back to North Korea, or if not, then killed. And he was killed in February 1997. They take their time, but they're very vengeful, like criminal organizations. You send a message, don't cross the line.
So that is what Putin and Kim have in common, it seems.
Yes, they're both, despotic murderers who are probably narcissistic, thinking that there's no compunction in this. This is something that needs to be done, and I'm so great.
Mm-hmm. And coming back to the question, so why is the sister regarded not as a threat right now? After 15 years, as you said before, when his daughter has grown up, then it's a different matter. Is that your conclusion?
It could be. But if I were to put it this way, ask an impious question, all these interesting characters in North Korea, Kim Jong-un, his stylish wife, their cute daughter, the aunt or the sister, Kim Yo Jong, who will live the longest? I don't know, but I would say the sister is in the running. She looks to me very intelligent, very calculating, quite, self-absorbed and obviously very rude, but very capable, much cleverer than her brother. But the two genuinely love each other as brother and sister. What is my basis? I've watched hundreds of hours of North Korean footage, video clips, and at public events in their country or at a summit meeting abroad, in Singapore with Trump, they look at each other frequently, not like a gaze, hello, but signs, like for a split second. And often they smile. There's a smirk smile on both of them, the brother and the sister. They genuinely, I think, trust and like each other and care for each other. So I think Kim Jong-un recognizes that his sister is the most trusted, intelligent, confidant, trusted aide. And I think Kim Jong-un finds that of great use. I think he appreciates it. Now, that could change, of course, once the children come of age.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds that the sister was his closest advisor as well, in a political sense, maybe foreign policy, domestic policy advisor. Does he have any other advisors, or do these advisors live a very short life? If they give the wrong advice or the advice he doesn't want to hear, they are being disappeared, or is it not like that?
Well, the great leader of North Korea is infallible. He can do no wrong. So when there was some criticism of the founder, Kim Il-sung, by pro-Soviet, pro-Chinese party members back in 1956, what did Kim Il-sung do? Have them arrested, have them killed. When Kim Jong-il came to power, what did he do? Did he act nicely? No, he needed to make a point, so had a lot of people killed. What did Kim Jong-un do? In the first few years, upon inheriting power in late 2011, he had about 350, according to the South Korean government, senior officials, defense minister, and so on, killed, sometimes with an anti-aircraft gun, machine gun, Soviet ZP-4, like 4-barrel machine gun, in a stadium with horror-stricken witnesses to watch the gruesome spectacle. They make a point. Don't cross the line. This is what happens. So let's say Kim Yo Jong 10 years from now, inherits the throne? Will she, by virtue of her identity, relatively young woman, a female, will she be a nicer supreme leader? Maybe, but I would argue probably she has a lot to prove. She'll think that she has to take a strong stance, and probably she will punish and have a lot of officials purged and killed, because that's the way of lifelong dictators with no term limit. That's what they do.
Thank you. Trinity.
Yes, anonymously, we have an attendee that is asking, the daughter of Kim Jong-un is attending public events recently, as his sister was also accompanying him in previous events. Is female presence part of Kim Jong-un's public diplomacy?
Yes and no. The grandfather had some senior officials who were women, but of course, despite claims of gender equality in this perfected communist country called North Korea, no, it's a male-dominated, very, very chauvinistic, patriarchal culture, always has been. And throughout Korean history, for much of the Confucian world, there was no equality between males and females. The fact that Kim Jong-un surrounds himself with some prominent women, like Foreign Minister Choi Sun-hee, a woman, Hyun Song-wol, who is Kim Jong-un's former girlfriend, she's sort of the event manager, makes sure that everything goes well according to protocol. And his sister, very visible, and his wife, unlike Kim Jong-un's father, who never appeared in public until late in his life with his lady friend, Kim Jong-un, even as of 2012, early in his reign, showed his wife, his stylish wife, to the public. What does that really say? It's noteworthy, it's to be noted, but does that mean a greater affinity for feminism, for equality among the sexes? I think we need to see more credible indicators before reaching that kind of conclusion. So, the emergence of Kim Yo Jong as sort of a co-crime boss of this criminal regime, and very publicly making nuclear threats. Kim Yo Jong has made several threats of preemptive nuclear strike against South Korea, a peaceful neighboring state, in written form. And that means, she's telling the world that I too have my finger on the button. Mm-hmm. And this is unprecedented, I think, in world history. There are no checks and balances in North Korea. And to Professor Larres' question, what happens to these high officials? Well, many have a very long and happy career, and then their own sons, that kind of power and privilege and relative wealth passed down to their son in many cases, but also many have a very short and brutal end to their life on a whim. And it's been the prerogative of the three great leaders, so-called, to play God. That is, to quote Shakespeare, how does it go? As flies are to wanton boys, so are we to the gods. They play us for their sport. They kill people, they have public executions on a whim. Mm-hmm. And it's reported as of at least April, May 2021 from North Koreans inside the country from different regions that Kim Yo Jong has been vigorously issuing execution orders of high-ranking officials, of criminals, people who have been caught smuggling across the border, and high-ranking officials who get on her nerves or look at her in a funny way. And I know that sounds crazy, but it sounds credible to me because that's been their way of life. And she has now risen to, not on par with her brother, of course, but sort of a deputy great leader, a deputy despotess, a woman despot. So for her to issue that kind of cruel, vicious, capricious execution orders are informed with her family history. That's what they've been doing throughout the entire sweep of North Korea's existence.
Thank you. The current great leader's health is not particularly good. There have been all sorts of rumors flying about, from cancer and serious illnesses to something much more superficial and less serious. Do you have more information? What is his state of health?
Well, there's a history of both the father and grandfather died of cardiac arrest, which is, of course, a common cause of death all around the world. All three were visibly overweight, as in, I think it's a medical term, morbidly overweight. Kim Jong-un suffered gout in 2014, and reportedly his sister sort of ran the government for the several weeks that he was absent. We know that Kim Jong-un is a chain smoker. He smokes right in front of his child at public events, of course. He can do anything he wants to. We know that he's a heavy drinker. By all accounts, people who've dined with him say he's the great imbiber. I came up with that silly phrase. But for example, at the Inter-Korean Summit banquet in April 2018, South Korea's principals, the head of the intelligence service, the foreign minister, defense minister, and so on, they all stood in line to pour a drink for Kim Jong-un. In Korean custom, Asian custom, you politely pour with both hands a drink into your senior's cup or glass. Kim Jong-un, of course, being who he is, accepted just with one hand, not showing deference. And people, very happily poured relatively high dosage, high alcohol content brew, pear liquor. Well, not that high, but 25% or so. He downed all of them, at least 30, in addition to wine and other things he imbibed during the meal. So we know he's a heavy drinker, and he doesn't look to be in the greatest health. But who knows? He's still young. He's not quite 40 yet. He'll turn 40 next January. Kim Yo Jong turns 36 next Tuesday, the 26th. I think that's Tuesday. So they're both, relatively young and could be around for another 40 years. Who knows?
I'm sure you will send your book to her as a birthday present.
I have a, never mind. Thank you. I appreciate it. In some ways, I assume I'm being silly here, but, I think she's narcissistic. So some guy out there, nobody writing an entire book on her, probably, maybe she's not entirely displeased by that. Who knows?
Thank you. Trinity, do we have some more questions?
We do. This one asks Professor Lee, do you think West and especially US is also to be blamed for today's isolation of North Korea and and today's regime? Unlike respectful truce with Vietnam, US or the West never acknowledged their mistake for their war and atrocities in the Korean Peninsula. We have seen figures like Nixon and Kissinger who have visited China, but we didn't see in the case of North Korea. So do you think that the current situation of North Korea is also a failure of diplomacy?
Well, there are multiple reasons for the state of affairs today and the nature of the bilateral relationship between Washington and Pyongyang, and there's blame to go around. But the primary responsibility, the primary blame, I would think, lies with the decisions made by the North Korean leadership. In the COVID era, for example, the Biden administration and South Korea, the UN, many countries have offered vaccine aid repeatedly, food aid repeatedly, and Kim Jong-un said, no, thank you. We're not interested. So it's not that we are being stingy or mean. It's just that they have their own way of doing things, and they are not responding to our initiatives, offers of aid. And historically, yes, the United States bombed North Korea to the ground, unrestricted aerial warfare, horrible tactics that led to hundreds of thousands, over a million civilian deaths. The terrible warfare we saw during the Second World War that Germany practiced, that Japan also practiced, that was what happened in the Korean War. So we must not forget that. We must remember that and reflect upon such an imposition of heavy death and casualties on the innocent North Korean civilian population. At the same time, we also know who started the war. We also know Stalin and Mao were only reluctant supporters of Kim Il-sung's campaign. We also know North Korea committed atrocities and so on. So I think pointing American actions during the Korean Wars more than 70 years ago as a main culprit or factor in the state of affairs today is not irrelevant. It's not unsound, but probably not that pertinent when you put together sort of a pyramid or a list of relevant factors. I think it would rank fairly low in your hierarchy of historical causes, and the decisions made by Kim Jong-un and his predecessors would probably rank much higher at the top. Nobody made Kim Jong-il or Kim Jong-un do what they did, starve the people. Quite the contrary. A lot of food aid for free has been given by various parties, including the United States. The US gave North Korea $1.3 billion worth of food and fuel between 1995 and 2008. That's the Clinton and the George W. Bush administrations. South Korea has given much, much more, including cash. What do they do with that aid, including cash? No one knows for sure, but at the time, Kim Jong-il called his nation and his policy military-first politics, military first. So one assumes that some of it, if not a large share of that kind of generous cash aid, went into building bombs, missiles, and so on. So the decisions made by the Kim regime, I think, really explains the state of affairs today more than actions, decisions taken by Washington or Seoul or China or Russia or Japan or any other party.
Thank you. If you were Kim today and there was talk about lifting sanctions in return for giving up the nuclear program and nuclear weapons, would you do that if you were Kim? Which is difficult to imagine, I know, but if you were.
Well, it's actually written into law. The first ever US sanctions legislation on North Korea was introduced in 2013, and it was finally signed into law by President Obama in 2016, February 2016. Before then, there was not a single US North Korea sanctions legislation, and the conditions for suspending sanctions for half a year or year, and the conditions for lifting sanctions are all in there. They're all stipulated. And if North Korea changes, dismantles its nuclear program, dismantles its gulags,
I understand that. What I meant is, if you were putting yourself into the skin of Kim and looking at the political situation, the geopolitical situation with his point of view, would you then trust the Americans, trust the West, trust even the Chinese, and give up your nuclear program in return for whatever?
No. And from North Korea's point of view, building the bomb is a rational choice, not because they're so paranoid of an imminent or long-term American military campaign against them, that is in the future or now or in the future, but because it's essential to achieving its supreme national task as it's stipulated in the North Korean Constitution of incorporating South Korea, its territory, and its people, effecting a Vietnam-style military force-led unification. Why? Because marrying, putting together a nuclear-tipped warhead on an ICBM and being a present, constant, credible nuclear threat to the US mainland, which North Korea is very close to achieving today, that's been the long-term goal, so that North Korea would have the leverage to resort to some provocation, small-scale attacks, to create a crisis and then sue for peace and demand the full withdrawal of US troops from South Korea. Kim Yo Jong issued a statement in August 2021 demanding that the US withdraw its troops and its war machines, she said, referring to strategic assets and other weapons. But she upped the ante in July this year. She said, even if the US put that on the table, US troops withdrawal, no, we're not going to talk to you. Because you can reverse that decision within days, she said. You can always send back soldiers. So this is a female great leader mind trick. It's psychological manipulation, kind of dangling this out there, but saying we're not even interested. Now the US is running out of options to entice North Korea to return to the negotiating table. And when North Korea complies, calls for it, this potential option, even for if in another Trump administration, the Trump administration puts that on the table, withdrawal of US troops, and Trump has been amenable to it when he was in power. Even then, North Korea, Kim Yo Jong has upped the ante by saying, we're not interested, you got to give us more.
So what that means essentially is that the North Korea problem is not solvable at all.
Well, if there's an internal uprising, and again, there are no signs of such, and the people take action and are able to depose Kim, then across the southern border, there is an entirely pleasant, free, rich Korean state that can govern the people of North Korea with their consent. There is an alternative Korean state, and this is a long-term metaphysical, it's an existential threat to the regime, the fear of being absorbed by the richer South. And South Korea has been like a magnet for the people of North Korea. They take great risks to resettle in the South. Small numbers, 34, 35,000 people so far, about half of a big football stadium. So not that big, but they go on an arduous journey at the risk of being killed, captured and tortured and killed, to live better and freely. So the fact that you have a more legitimate, nicer Korean state that many nations around the world recognize as the more legitimate Korean state, it's a long-term problem. Would the North Korean leader be content to be relegated forever to preside over the loser Korean state? Or would he be more amenable to trying to fix that problem? I think the latter.
But I have to ask now, does South Korea actually want unification? Isn't his interest in united Korea growing by the year?
Would the South Korean public now support any adventurous campaign by the South Korean government to take over North Korea? No, because that would come with risks. Are South Koreans really clamoring for reunification? Well, South Koreans have this wonderful unification song, brings tears to South Koreans and North Koreans' eyes when they meet and sing it together. But in the real world, no. South Korea remains largely apathetic to reunification prospects, to North Korea itself. They live in sort of a blasé denialism of the North Korean threat. They just want money, throw them some things, they're like unwelcome distant neighbors who come begging for some money. Oh, they're just paranoid, they're just shooting off missiles because they're afraid of Americans and so on. This kind of unrealistic assessment of North Korea is very pervasive in South Korea, and you must be asking why. South Korea has a very high level of education, one of the world's highest level of college participation, people going to four-year college. Are they dumb? Obviously not. What's happening? There is no, well, for one thing, you can't live in constant 24-hour fear of North Korea. That would drive you crazy as a nation. So a little bit of denialism is understandable, certainly. But there is no real incentive to take interest in North Korea, in South Korea. There is no incentive to study because North Korea is not on the national college entrance exam. People don't teach you about North Korea in high schools. There are only a handful of colleges in South Korea that offer North Korean studies as a major. And one reason is there's no money in North Korean studies. So it's not a perfect situation, far from it, but this kind of indifference to North Korea and the terrible suffering of the people of North Korea, pervasive throughout South Korea, is regrettable, but I don't see it changing anytime soon.
That reminds us a little bit, at least, of the German problem at the time. When that process of unification started to unfold in 1989, many West Germans were not interested in unification, were thinking that it would have high economic costs. But in the course of the development, that of course changed quite rapidly, and perhaps something similar would happen in South Korea. One never knows.
One never knows, and I think it's a real possibility, because if there is instability within North Korea itself, and China is about to send troops to restore peace and stability and so on, and perhaps even expand its influence or even carve out at some kind of North Korean territory for itself. If we come to that kind of contention, then I think many South Koreans, the majority, would be by then more willing, if not insisting upon, taking over North Korea. Because unlike Germany, Korea has been a single polity. Koreans have lived under a single political regime, monarchy, for thousands of years, for well over 1,000 years. And there's a high degree of ethnic, cultural homogeneity, one people, one language, one culture. So there is this ethnic nationalism on the part of people inside North Korea and South Korea. And whenever there is an inter-Korean summit, the dictator's shaking hands with his South Korean counterpart. In South Korea, the approval rating goes through the roof, 80%, 85%. You don't see that in a democracy, in a conventional democracy, almost like a Russian kind of, poll. Putin, 114% approval rating. Sometimes they get it wrong, So, it sells. People want peace. People want rapprochement. And when there's a showy, glitzy summit pageantry, people are pleased without really digging more deeply into why the dictator is coming out at this time. What does he have in mind? It makes for good TV, and your approval rating goes up. So whether it's a government on the left or right, it doesn't matter. It's an enticing prospect to shake hands, to meet with the North Korean leader.
Yeah,
and
thank you.
The sister is even, more glamorous, agreeable. So, she's an unprecedented weapon in the North Korean diplomatic toolbox, I would say.
Thank you. Trinity, perhaps we have one or two questions before we have to come to a rapid end of our program tonight.
Definitely. We have a question that asks, to what degree is the population of North Korea becoming more aware of the outside world? And how is this affecting Kim Jong-un's position and status?
Yes, we've seen the gradual rise of knowledge on the part of the North Korean population of the outside world over the past 20 years. The famine was a catalyst for North Koreans to escape their repressive nation, just to survive. That drove many North Koreans, tens of thousands of North Koreans outside North Korea, taking a great risk just to live, just to eat. And since then, we've seen more and more information about the outside world infiltrate North Korea, conveyed by traders, by tourists, and by smugglers. So most of North Korean defectors over the past decade who have resettled in South Korea say that they have been exposed to foreign news, even Voice of America, American news, programs, Radio Free Asia, but a lot of programming from South Korea and South Korean TV shows, drama, South Korean pop music, and so forth. Most have been exposed at least once, and there's a market, there's a demand for such information. Of course, freedom of information is a basic universal human right. It's Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, drafted in the 40s. And it's very telling that they said this, the freedom to impart, share, disseminate information, regardless of borders and regardless of medium. The chroniclers, the drafters were very prescient. Back then, there was TV, radio, newspaper, that's about it. But feeling a threat, Kim Jong-un passed a law in December 2020, increasing the punishment for people caught watching South Korean drama and so on. 15 years for repeat offenders. And if you are caught distributing on USBs or other media, South Korean content, execution. And that shows you, yeah, in this case, I think paranoia is the right word. The North Koreans, I'm sure, are not paranoid of an imminent US attack, of which there's been none since the armistice of 1953. But they do fear what might happen, like Romania in 1989, or other countries where you've seen large-scale popular uprisings swell and then blow up into a violent struggle, violence used by the state forces, and then even a bigger crowd now demanding the resignation of the dictator. North Korea certainly doesn't want to go there, and that's why they try their best to keep their people in the dark about the conditions of life outside their repressive nation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Trinity, let's have the final question for tonight.
Perfect. This question, first off, thanks Professor Lee for an extraordinarily informative and articulate talk. If you were in charge, what would you do? And what do you predict things will look like in 2033?
If I were in charge of what, North Korea or the US or South Korea? If I were in charge of North Korea, I'd probably do the same. No, I mean, it's such a terrible tragedy, a large-scale human tragedy, ongoing for decades. I should not make a flippant joke like that. If I were in charge of the United States, well, I would, have my people study history more, so that the next time the North Korean leader comes out smiling, calling for handshakes, we're a bit better prepared than, say, the Trump administration was. They will do that. North Korea, contrary to the public perception out there, is crazy and so on. No, they don't go just all berserk. They don't go all out and want a nuclear war right now. They go up through a graduated ladder of escalation, and then dramatically they come down. They know when to pull back. And that's the time they create excitement, even, as I said before, unrealistic and exuberant expectations of reform and change and peace and all that. That's why the bigger powers have been so generous with North Korea. Whenever North Korea calls for talks, they listen, they come with a lot of blandishments, a lot of aid. So the next time North Korea does that, I believe Kim Yo Jong will be the face of that post-provocation peace ploy. And one has to be careful. If she wants to come to Washington, don't say no, but don't underestimate her. Don't just look at a charming, smiling North Korean royalty and think just because she's a woman, she's nicer, or that this time it's real. Be realistic and prepare. And preparation comes from a good foundational knowledge of what's happened in the past.
Thank you very much. Perhaps finally, what is your prediction? Will North Korea survive its domestic challenges, but also its foreign policy challenges? So in 2033, as Brian Keeler suggested, or maybe in 2040, will there still be an independent North Korea, which is a problem for the rest of the world?
Well, on the trajectory of history, Chinese history, as expert as you are, as an expert, it's the rise and fall of dynasties on average is across 3 generations, like every 100 years. There are exceptions like the Qing and the Ming dynasties. North Korea has been in place for, 75 years, slightly less than 80 years. So it's conceivable that in another 10 years or 20 years, North Korea could collapse. I don't think it's impossible. It's just that I don't see any signs. I'm unable to see any signs like that. But what I would confidently say is, as long as the Kims, not another Kim is a common last name, of course, but as long as this family regime endures, whether it's Kim Jong-il or his sister or the daughter 20 years from now or son, as long as it's one of them, the so-called heirs of the Mount Paektu bloodline, that's a real majestic mountain straddling the border between North Korea and South Korea, and it's the cradle, the birthplace of the Korean people in the Korean mythology, and North Korea has politically appropriated that and call themselves the Mount Paektu, sacred Mount Paektu bloodline royalty. As long as North Korea is governed by one of them, North Korea is not going to change.
Thank you very much, Professor Sung-Yoon Lee. I would like to thank you for your insights, for telling us, enlightening us about what is going on in North Korea and the leadership of North Korea. It's a very informative story, but also a very sad and depressing story. And perhaps in the future, we will have more to talk about North Korea, but in a more positive and optimistic way. Let's hope for the best. I would like to thank our audience for sticking with us today for over 90 minutes. Much appreciated. That was a Krasno Global Event Series for tonight. We will have more programs in the future, and I will announce them in due course. If you want to be on my mailing list, please send me an email, larres@unc.edu, and will happily add you to the mailing list. And don't forget our famous YouTube channel. That is youtube.com/KrasnoUNC, and all our programs will be on our famous YouTube channel. And once again, Professor Sung-Yoon Lee, thank you very much for joining us tonight. It has been a real pleasure, and we all learned an awful lot from you. Thanks very much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you very much.